All right, so it's a pleasure, of course, to welcome Bill Killam. Bill is a long friend of the HCIL. And actually, I see your name has changed now, so that's good. It actually says Bill Killam. So Bill is a long friend of the HCIL. He runs a human factor engineering consulting firm in Virginia, so really a practitioner, but also a foot in the research side, and he also teaches undergrad courses, I believe in the HCIM program, but in the high school for sure, in interaction design, research methods, and usability testing. So it's been really a wonderful partner for HCIL and Maryland in general. You should know also he will teach an introduction to HCI, to usability testing, I think. Yes, it's an introduction to usability testing at the HCIL symposium. You should all know about the HCIL symposium. It's May 27, and we should put the address also, best maybe. But we hope to see all you there. But in the meantime, here is Bill. Bill, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Let me share my screen to get started here. It always helps. So if I'm not mistaken, you guys can now see my screen. Is that correct, somebody?
Yes, you're all good.
Excellent. Okay, so I appreciate the opportunity. It's always good to work with the university, and Catherine's introduction. I have had the pleasure of being able to teach for several years there on and off, and have been doing the HCIL open house. And so I'm pleased to be able to present today. I appreciate the opportunity. This particular project is, I call it a case study. It's become an example that I use in class, primarily because it covers pretty much all of the aspects of a project from soup to nuts, all the way from the initial implementation, the reason for the project to start, all the way through both qualitative and quantitative assessments. It has a twist to the story that changed over time. It used to be a better story, in my opinion, but there's still another lesson to learn here. So with no more than that introduction, let me walk you through the story here. So if you know the National Cancer Institute, it has a number of functions. It supports and manages a lot of cancer research. It collects lots of cancer information, surveillance data. But one of its functions is to disseminate that information back to the general public. And so they have a number of resources. They have information about various types of cancer, cancer treatment, cancer prevention, so on. In the case of surveillance data that they've collected, they have developed a couple statistical models that they use to help people predict their risks of certain cancers. And in this case, they actually have three of them. They do breast cancer, melanoma, and colorectal cancer. There's enough surveillance data that you can enter in information about yourself, and it will give you an estimate of your risk of cancer based on this long-running history of surveillance data. The reason this project came about, and this is, there's a couple, I always tell my students, there's a couple of occasions when an UI change comes about, often when you're changing platforms, whether it's hardware or software. In this particular case, and this is another driving factor for it, there was a researcher there, and Paul Hahn, Dr. Hahn, he's from Maine Medical, sorry, lost him for a second there. He's from Maine Medical, but he was on assignment at NCI. And he was particularly interested in the effects of uncertainty and randomness in how people perceive risk. This just happened to be an area of research of his, and he happened to be in the area of colorectal cancer. So when he saw what the NCI was presenting for information on colorectal cancer, he initiated a project to see if it could be improved. My company at the time was working with their Office of Market Research and Evaluation, so we were doing a lot of usability work for them. And so this project came to us. And the way that the system worked, there's a series of 21 possible questions. Obviously, not all of them need to be asked. So if it asked you if you smoked and you said no, it didn't ask you how many cigarettes. But it asks you a series of these 21 questions. It asked them one at a time, basically just populating the screen as you went. Once you answered all of those questions, it would then present you with this information you see on the screen here. And so it gave you your prediction for the next 5 years, 10 years, and lifetime with the average risk you see as a link. And under that link, it basically told you that for people with similar characteristics of age and gender and so on, that's how you compare yourself. But the concern that Paul had with this information was that it gives an absolute number. It just says 0.3%. And knowing that that's not an accurate statement, since there is a confidence interval that has to be dealt with, and also issues that we know about in like numeracy. There's an article, I meant to look it up and make sure I got the name right before today, and I forgot. I believe it's called When 0.2 is Bigger Than 2. And it has to do with people's perception or understanding of data, especially when it's in a percentage format. And so he was concerned that this information was not being presented accurately to the general public, at least in the way that they understood it. So we started this project looking at the interface and discovered, first of all, that just some basic interaction design issues. Presenting questions one at a time, 21 in a row, with no indication of where you were in the process didn't seem like the best design idea. So these were some fairly simple things to do. So from the interaction design standpoint, we broke it up into a series of questions by page. We added a progress indicator so you knew how far along you were. We did add the code logic that would show and hide information as you answered questions. We also provided something that ironically they didn't have, which was the ability to edit your information. The way that the tool worked is you got this data, and then if you wanted to enter in new information for somebody else or change something you entered, you basically had to go back and find the earlier link and start over again. So some simple interaction design changes, nothing too sexy here. When it came to the display of information, we knew that there'd been some research done. So the first thing that we did was we did some literature search. And we looked at various articles on presenting risk data, presenting health data to the general public. There's lots of resources out in that area. And what we identified were 9 separate guidelines for presenting risk. The absolute and comparative risk they handled. The duration of the risk, again, they handled that. They didn't provide anything about risk reduction strategies. So the information didn't tell you where your risk came from, what added to your risk, what you could do about your risk. So we knew that that was an area we could improve on. The numeracy issue I mentioned earlier. So recommendations were that you always want to present your information in both percentages and frequency format in order to help people understand it. Presenting the risk in words and numbers to help people. The visual display of risk was noted as an important one, and that's where I started to get excited because we wanted to get into some visualization. The risk estimate contains a level of uncertainty was actually a research finding, and so we knew we wanted to address that. Basically, what the research had concluded was that the more you precisely state the data, the less people believe it. So if you were to state to somebody that their risk was 17.315%, people would look at that information and believe that it just doesn't make any sense. You can't possibly predict at that level. And then comparing risk to other risk hazards, and finally framing the risk in both positive and negative terms. So these were the guidelines that we found and wanted to see what we could incorporate into this particular design. And the area I mentioned of visual display of risk was one that had been researched in the past, and we did find some examples. So one of the common ways to do this is to use this kind of homunculus diagram. So you populate an image with the number of people separated out. So this was one we knew we wanted to try and see what the effects were. There'd also been some research on using bar charts, indicating conditions where they were and were not useful. The idea of reflecting uncertainty had been researched at Hahn et al. 2006. That's actually Paul Hahn, who was on the project. And again, I mentioned the overly precise estimates causing problems. And so we were looking at a way to do this. Now, we had done some prior work with the National Cancer Institute on a tool that was used by doctors. And in that case, in order to display the uncertainty of the estimate and avoid the effect that we had seen, and that was that when you give a point estimate with the confidence interval, the point estimate gets remembered, but the confidence interval doesn't necessarily get remembered. And so people have a tendency to recall the center point. And we wanted to make sure that they understood the range. So we eliminated the standard format of showing an estimate plus or minus, or showing an estimate with error bars on it. And we went to this format of showing a bar indicating the 95% confidence interval. But in this case, we were working with physicians. They understood confidence intervals, and we weren't sure how well this might work with the general public. So we started to do some qualitative research. We typically, in my company, we typically use mockups. I do have a developer on staff when we need to get into something a little more sophisticated than we can do in something like Acture, which is our most common tool. And the NCI was able to give us the R code that was needed to actually use their data in order to drive our simulation. So we looked at this idea of the homunculus diagram. And what we were trying to give was this idea of uncertainty. So we started with the diagram, as you see on the left, which shows you that 5%, and this is assuming a range of 5 to 13%. And so what this particular diagram would do is it would start with 5%, and then it would populate itself across, as you see the arrow there, to 13%. Those people would show up. Then they would one by one fade out. And so it would go back and forth between 5 and 13%. So we tested this particular visualization with some people, and we got an interesting result, which turned out to be supported in other research. What people said when they saw this diagram was this group of 5 people here will get cancer. The group between 5 and 13 might get cancer, and all of these other people won't get cancer. And so it really conveyed a message we were not intending to convey. It was supposed to show the idea of uncertainty in risk predictions. Any given individual has a percentage chance of developing this cancer. But instead, it caused people to group them together, a kind of overuse of the Gestalt principle of similarity here. And I went back and did some more research and found out that was a problem even in a static display of people thinking that this group of people who were shown in the diagram had some kind of similarity that distinguished them from everybody else, and not that they developed cancer, but there was some characteristic that caused them to have a higher risk. So this one failed on us. We did go to a bar chart version, which acted the same way. It started at 5%, increased to 13%, dropped back down to 5% to try to eliminate the person component. This one wasn't particularly well understood. So in this case, people were just confused, where in this case, they had an interpretation that just was wrong. But we got some people to describe this the way we were hoping, at least a bit. So we started to play with it a bit more. We tried going with this diagram, which shows, instead of starting from 0, it shows the range of the value. We tried adding some fade on the ends of it to get that sense of uncertainty. And this was probably in the project the most interesting thing for me was when they saw the top diagram, they understood 5 to 13%, but they thought it was somewhat absolute. When we added the fade to try to indicate that this is not even within the 5 to 13, there's still some probability it could be different than that. People just didn't understand the fade. It didn't make any sense to them. They said, I don't understand why you've got why it's not a solid bar. But when we put the anchor points in the middle of the fade, several people spontaneously described this as a confidence interval. And I recall one person saying specifically, well, it looks like the chance is 5 to 13, but it might be a bit higher or lower than that. And so suddenly we discovered, and I to this day, I can't tell you why the positioning of that line makes so much difference to people. But just by placing it in the middle of the fade, we got people to start to describe this exactly the way we wanted to understand it. We then moved on to the rest of the information we wanted to convey. So we did want to put it on a scale of 0 to 100. Since several of you are younger than I am, you might not know the famous book, How to Lie with Statistics. And one of the principles that they have in 1934 was the book, and it describes something called the gee whiz diagram, which is that any diagram, when you zoom into it, you can see data seem to fluctuate. And comparing across scales becomes difficult because the scale keeps changing to show the data. So we wanted to show the data on a scale of 0 to 100, but the data was so small that we knew it was going to be a problem. So we came up with this diagram that showed the value on 0 to 100, but showed a blow up so you could see the data at the gee whiz view, and then added the average risk as a pointer on it. This diagram worked well, except when it was presented to people, and what we discovered was that it was too much information. So there was a tendency to notice the absolute risk here, possibly notice it on the scale. That was simple enough. They tended to miss the average risk. So what we did was we modified it so that it built the display over a 2-second build. I think it might have been 1 second. So it would first display the scale, then the average risk would appear on the scale to draw their attention. Then we would draw on their risk, and then the risk would blow up and show them their risk in a view they could actually see. So this was seemed to be handling the idea of uncertainty in their cancer risk. And then we looked to explain it in text.
Bill,
Yes, please.
Can I interrupt just a second? I'm just wondering before, I mean, it's really wonderful. You show us so many design and feedback on what you learned from them. I wonder if you could say a few words about how you do the testing in this case, you know, whether
Sure.
formal experiments or how did you do it?
As I mentioned, it was qualitative research. So we were able to recruit a small number of participants. We had the luxury of doing this over time, and we had a lab that we could use, so we didn't have to cluster them. So typically when we have to do some testing, we often have a lab, and so you have to rent the space in a lab. You have to schedule everybody at the same time. The National Cancer Institute allowed us to use their space, and so we weren't restricted to doing it over time. So what we did was we brought in people to do this evaluation. We would present the information to them, and then we would ask them what they recall of the information that was presented. So it was we don't use the think aloud. I have lots of reasons why I don't like the think aloud protocol. So what we did instead was we had them have the experience and then discuss with us afterwards what they recall. Right. Being in a mock-up, the nice thing in that is that as we discover things, we can make changes to it to see if we could improve it. Right. So if we were doing a round of testing, for instance, on this particular display, and my developer gave me a tool that I could actually put in the top and bottom value, and I could show this with a wide range. I could show it high in the scale, low on the scale, wherever I wanted. So we could see variations in that effect. But we could also change how long the delay was. So if it seemed like the delay was taking too long, and we learned that over a couple of participants, we could actually modify that for the rest of our participants. Being qualitative research, we go somewhere between 8 and 15 people usually, recruited one at a time for these sessions. And if we discovered that we had some changes we made at the very end, we would go out and get a couple more people. So that's where that range came from.
So it looks like what's great is that it allows you to test a lot of designs and then quickly eliminate the things that don't work. Right.
Yeah, and having a mock-up and the ability to make those changes gives you the ability. I tell people, if you watched people walking down the hall and tripping and you go out and see a buckle in the rug, you don't need to watch 100 people to decide to take care of the buckle. So if we see something and believe it's an issue, we'll make the adjustment and see if that issue tends to go away. But it is taking a chance that we don't have a lot of data, but we have enough people looking at it that we're comfortable in making these choices.
Thank you.
And speaking of that, I was just going to mention that this was a case where when we were looking at text, which we wanted to add to that. So now that we had a diagram that appeared to work, we knew we wanted to describe it. In this case, we did the same thing, except in this case, we used an eye tracker. Now, I don't typically use an eye tracker for most of the design work because there's just way too much going on in the peripheral vision, in perception of data. So I don't like to use an eye tracker for most designs unless we're looking specifically at text. And the value of it with text is that we could actually see people struggle with some of the phrases. So for instance, if it said 95% of sure the actual percentage of people, and people weren't sure what that word actual percentage of people meant, we would see that they would read it and then their eyes would go back and read that actual percentage maybe 2 or 3 times. And this would help us identify where in the descriptions we were having problems. It might be an order issue, it might be a wording issue. Again, we're not doing a large sample, but if we saw a pattern of people struggling with certain cases, we would adjust those and see if we could eliminate those through this text. So that took another round of evaluations, and then we combined them together with the winner text. We added some bolding to help identify the key phrases in there. And these two gave us what we were going to incorporate into the final design for uncertainty, which left us with the question of randomness. We also wanted to address that. And we decided that we did have to address them separately. So we ended up going back to the homunculus diagram and came up with an idea of, instead of showing them as an array that builds, we would show a random set of the homunculus icons in here, and then they would fade out, and then a different random set would appear. And one question was, should we do this with the center point within the range, or should we do this with the range? And so we did test those various versions, and we found that if we would do the range that showed 5 people, and then they would fade out, and then maybe it would be 7 people if the range was 5 to 15, and then they would fade out, and a different set of 15 people would show up, that it was getting the point across, but people didn't quite get what we were saying by the diagram alone. Now, the nice thing on this earlier diagram was that the diagram worked and the text added reinforcement for what they perceived. When it came to this diagram, they didn't understand it until we explained it to them after the testing. And so we went back to the wording and we discovered that we needed some words that would describe that. We went through the same process and we found the phrases, the phraseology we wanted. And so we combined those two together. And what we found was that if the two were together, everybody understood it. If we showed them just because they didn't seem to understand the visual, we actually tried without the visual and they didn't quite understand what we were saying. And if we showed the visual without the text, they didn't understand the visual. But if we put the two together, everything made sense to them. So this was the output that we had for showing cancer risk as the uncertainty associated, the randomness that's associated with any kind of risk prediction. And when there was just a small issue of dealing with it when your risk dropped below 1,000, dropped below 1 in 100. So on the uncertainty diagram, that was simple enough to do. On the randomness diagram, we went to an array of 1,000 instead of an array of 100. And so we ended up with our final design. Combining those two together, we have this as an output. This side over here, as you can see, is the ability to find out the things that affect your risk. And the way that it works is that if you see the risk here and then you say, well, I'm going to increase my regular exercise, it would show this as gray and then indicate the new risk value on top of it. So you could see the effect and you could actually do multiple effects and say, okay, if I don't do that, but I stop smoking, what happens? Well, what happens if I increase exercise and stop smoking? And so it would combine them all for you. And if I'm not mistaken, this is my demo. So here's a video of the tool in action. You'll see we're on section 1 of 7. You have a series of questions to answer. First, some demographic information. You'll notice that while I was doing the demo, I forgot to select my sex. The demo doesn't care what you enter, so it won't have any effect. Here's a case where if you answer that you have exercise, then it asks you a follow-up question about the amount of exercise. Same thing with having a colonoscopy or a sphygmoscopy. If you answer yes, you have to say whether there were findings or not. It asks about use of NSAIDs or non-NSAIDs. We're almost there. Asks about your exercise. Whether you ever smoked. And finally, ask you about your history with colorectal cancer. So here's the calculated display that appears. You'll notice the diagram builds on itself. There is an option there on the right where you can do the adjustments, as I mentioned, but you can also select what determined my risk. And this tells you the things that you answered that lowered your risk and the things that you answered that increased your risk. And when you select, does this mean that I will get cancer? That's where you see the animation there. It starts with a series somewhere between 9 and 13, and then they fade out and a different 9 to 13 appear. And then finally, we go back to the results and go back to the results. There we go. And then you can edit your personal information if you want to, or you can start over. So this was all a simulation. We had 4 versions. We had a 2 for males and 2 for females. We had 1 version each that had a low risk value and a high risk value. And we would give people the answers we wanted them to enter. So in this case, now that we had a completed tool, we brought them in, we had them enter in these 4 cases saying, here's information about a person, 2 males and 2 females, enter it into the tool. And then we're going to discuss your thoughts at the end. The order of the presentation of the cases was, quote, randomized. It wasn't truly randomized, but we varied them for the individuals. And we got a reaction to what people learned and what they thought about the risk being high or low. Again, still qualitative data. We're not in a position yet to do anything quantitative, but we received enough information back to indicate that they understood the sense of risk. The only change that happened between this design and what was actually implemented was this area here on the left. So in the design, as I mentioned, if you selected one of these options, this would indicate what would happen if you started taking aspirin and ibuprofen 3 times a day, and it would show you what the lowered risk was. When we showed this tool to the statisticians, they said they couldn't make that claim. And the reason was, for instance, that if you're overweight, the data shows you what your cancer risk is if you're overweight. If you're not overweight, it shows you what your risk is if you're not overweight. But the data they didn't collect, was what if you were overweight and you lost the weight? What is your risk now? And so this was projecting something their data simply didn't support. And so the only change that was made between this design and the final implementation was that what determined my risk was eliminated, and that display was actually here in place of these controls. In the old days, I was able to then show that we turned over this design as a simulation with all of the specifications associated with it to the development team. And in a matter of only 2 weeks, they were able to implement this design. And for all intents and purposes, except for that one change that I mentioned, and one other slight change, we display questions when you answer one and you need to answer it. They displayed both questions and graded out if you answered in the other direction. I'm not sure why they decided to make that change in implementation, but they did. But this looked and behaved exactly the same way that we designed it, which again was why I use this as a case study, that the relationship between design and development in an ideal world from a UX standpoint is waterfall. If you design it, test it, you know and you know it's feasible, You can turn it over. They basically had no questions for us. The only question was whether it was 508 compliant, which it is. And so they implemented it, and it took them just a couple of weeks. It took us several months to get through the research, but it took very few weeks for them to implement this design. Unfortunately, and this is where the end of my story usually was, to show them that the design came out exactly as it was designed and evaluated. NCI hired a new contractor to support their website. And they had decided that they're going to move them to a new content management system. And so when we eventually got around to the colorectal cancer risk assessment tool, they took the tool and they re-implemented it. And today, sorry, let me get to the screen. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a little ahead of myself. After we did this implementation at NCI, Dr. Hahn went back to Maine Medical, and he used it at Maine Medical for an initiative that they had there to try to get people to get colorectal cancer screening. And so he did some quantitative research associated with it. He had 225 participants and showed different textual representations, and found that the randomness uncertainty did increase people's perception of risk, but also their motivation. So there's some data here on that. I'm watching the time here because I don't want to run over and not have time for questions. There was another experiment that was done with 240 participants, looking at other dimensions of what we worked on. The most interesting one for me was later they did an experiment where they were testing to see if people receiving this data would actually be more motivated to get their colorectal cancer screening, which turns out to be the biggest predictor of survival, is just detecting that you have colorectal cancer early enough. And so they had an initiative at Maine Medical. It was a drive to get people to do that. And they used this tool and found that it did actually increase the probability of people going and getting their screening done. But here's the story I started to tell, is that the old days I could show this design and it was implemented, but when the new contractors came in and they were implementing the design, they decided that, okay, we know what the tool is doing, so they re-implemented it, and today, this is the colorectal cancer risk assessment tool. Asks you a series of questions, very much like we did, but the results are simply a pie graph. No uncertainty, no randomness, no ability to edit your data. They essentially went back to square one during the implementation. To them, it's the same thing. It's showing the data. So they didn't realize the effect they had. And unfortunately, all of that research that we did and the great findings kind of fell by the wayside. So it's a sad story today, but the project was excellent. So that's my story.
Wow, wow, that's kind of, I don't like the ending, but
I didn't either.
Story. Well, I mean, of course, part of me feels like maybe it's not too late, maybe something will change, but so of course my first question might be, did the story and the design results were published?
Yes, so I actually published this in the Human Factors Ergonomics Society. I did a presentation at the healthcare open house, healthcare symposium that we had actually here. And then Paul and I and several others, as you can see, published several articles on its use in the field. So there's several papers that have been put out on the use of this tool.
Yeah, so maybe we'll share the link to the paper. I'm looking in the, I see Bill has a question, but I'm not sure if it's really a question. At one point in the chat, I had said, you said they were removing the researchers wanted to, the NCI researcher wanted to remove a way for people to go back, as you said, what if I eat less or exercise more? But am I correct that people could go back in the form and change the way they enter the data and then get a new?
They could.
Right.
Yeah.
So just a little bit more complicated.
If they were savvy enough and they wanted to try that, they'd say, well, what if I told you that I was exercising when I said I didn't? Then you could see it. You couldn't see it as a direct comparison. And that was really the only concern, was that they said they just couldn't support the idea that if you have this risk of cancer and then you suddenly start exercising, do they really know what the result is? Because they didn't collect that kind of data. They collected plenty of data on people who were regular exercisers, or people who exercise regularly and people who don't, but they didn't have any data on people who didn't exercise and started to. Right. And so they just said, we just can't support that. So they didn't want it as a direct comparison, but certainly you could go back and re-enter data and discover that.
Yeah. So Bill, I don't know if you want to ask your question or if it was, I don't quite understand what you mean actually. But Bill was saying, well,
sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, maybe I missed this when you're talking about it, but did their rationale for why they didn't include this this great graphic? And I apologize if I missed it, but so often you hear, you do the work for the clients and then they like, yeah, okay, this is great. We're just gonna stick with what we got. So I'm just wondering what you heard back.
Yeah, it was really that they just couldn't support that conclusion that a person with this risk who starts eating more vegetables will reduce their risk. They simply said, we don't know what the actual risk would be. So it turns out that we could find out that a person who didn't eat a lot of vegetables had this risk, and a person who ate a lot of vegetables had a different risk. But they simply didn't know that if you started eating vegetables, would that become your risk? Or because you had a higher risk, how much would you drop? How long would you have to eat vegetables for that drop to occur? So they just said, from a science standpoint, we can't support it. What was interesting was when I presented it to the healthcare industry, they said, that doesn't matter to us, because if we say to them, look, if you had been eating vegetables, your risk could have been this low, you need to start eating vegetables. To them, this was more a way to convince people to change their behavior. To the scientists at NCI, it was whether or not they could justify claiming that a person at one risk eating vegetables becomes a different risk. They said, we don't know.
That's such an interesting distinction, because it does sort of get at this. Different organizations have different sort of constraints on how they think about and what they can do. So if you were doing this for like Kaiser Permanente Foundation, they might just say, yeah, go do it. Exactly. Whereas in this case, there's like, well, we're not sure, we're not 100% sure about the science. So, and exactly. It's NCI, so maybe that's, yeah.
That was it. You got it.
Any question from the audience before I ask another one? So then my next question was, what do you know about how much it's used and what the public reaction is? I just found it on I found it on the website. We could all try it, but we don't want to distract people too much. Maybe that's why they're not asking questions. They're all trying it, see if they need to eat more vegetables.
NCI didn't actually put any, NCI does a lot of analytics, but we never saw the analytics data for this particular tool to see if people used it more, used it less. Even if we had the analytics data, they weren't collecting any data on people's perception of this particular tool, which is why when Paul did it, we were able to actually see the effect of this particular tool, which was great. Yeah. Right. And NCI has, as I mentioned, they had 3 different models that they had. They had melanoma as well as breast cancer. This tool could have been used immediately for both of those just by changing the questions and changing which algorithm was driving it. They were in the transition to the new developer, and so they didn't even get to making these changes in the other 2. Yeah. So for a while, this tool had this output. The other 2 cancers had the old output. Would have been a great field study to just discover if there were differences there. Mm-hmm. The Office of Market Research and Evaluation actually shut down, and they were revamping a lot of stuff. And so the office shut down, the new contractor came in, this didn't get moved to the others. And then, as I said, it was like 2 years before they finally got around to this tool. And then they changed it on us. I was so disappointed because one day in class, I was showing it and saying, Lynn, look how great they implemented our design. And when I opened it up, it was not the design. So it was a surprise.
Yeah. So Wayne had his hand raised. So if you have, go ahead, Wayne.
Actually, Ben and Jenny might have been before me.
Oh, you know, I didn't see it. So
Okay.
go ahead.
They're just waving. Maybe they're just waving, saying hello.
We're just waving to Bill. Good to see him. Good to hear
Good to see
you.
you, man. How you doing? Hey, Jenny. I'm sorry. Go ahead. What was your question, Wayne?
Very good. So there's a lot of interest around the publication of null results in science and HCI in specific,
Right.
which is a tremendous value to the community, but very hard to get through the door. So I was curious in this case, right? So the fact that NCI did not engage with your design ultimately, it kind of speaks to some of that ecological contextual validity of what was going on. In any of the papers, did you include that as part of the process? It sounded like some of the conversations you had at the conference engage those issues, but is that kind of in the record?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by in the record.
So for example, did you talk about the reasons why NCI chose not to implement this the way you just answered Bill, in a way that's now part of our archival community record?
Oh, no, actually,
Or as a consultant,
they did
feel free.
implement this for colorectal cancer, and it survived until the new developer got to it. They didn't migrate it to the other tools, and they were happy with the results. I mean, we gave a presentation to the research staff. They were quite pleased with what we developed. They did have that one issue that I mentioned. And so there was an expectation that they were going to implement this across the board. But with the change in personnel and a loss of that corporate knowledge, the redesign just disappeared when they re-implemented. So, but I don't know, and we lost the our contract with NCI ended. And so there's really no data that I know. I bet if I talked to somebody at NCI today, they wouldn't even know about this because it's been long enough and personnel has changed enough.
Those are important parts of the story.
Yes, they are, yeah. Which is why, though it is kind of a sad ending to the story, I think it's another important message to let people know that this is still, after all of these years, this is still the battle that goes on. It's, I remember, Ben, you probably remember in '83 out in California at the CHI conference when we were predicting that the '80s were going to be the decade of HCI, right? We've gone through the 60s were hardware, the 70s was software, so the 80s were going to be the decade of HCI. Here we are in the 2000s to 2021, and we're still trying to wrestle this away enough from the developers to say, we got to work as a team here. That you have a value, but we have a value, and you can't just eliminate us or assume you know what we do. Still fighting it out.
Yeah, great. Yeah, the 80s were the decade of HCI, but so were the 90s and the 2010s and the 2020s. It's our decade. We run the table. Your results are really interesting, and it's such a practical, very straight, very concrete application with a real contractor, and the story is interesting. I wonder if you've been in touch with Jessica Holman, who's been sort of the kind of star in promoting the idea of uncertainty. She's written a bunch of very prominent papers, including a really nicely done one in Scientific American about a little more than a year ago. But I think if you get in touch with her, she's at Northwestern University, but I think this would be really interesting because a lot of her work and others are laboratory studies, and this is a much more concrete, realistic application that may be interesting to her, and maybe she can help tell your story or help put this forward. So Jessica Holman, if you want an introduction, I can.
That'd be great, Ben. I really appreciate it. Yeah, the name's familiar, and I think I probably saw some of her research.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd love to contact her. I hear from Paul every now and then, and we keep talking about wanting to do some more because this was a very exciting, and he still sees the value of it. So it's
who?
Paul Hahn. He's the researcher from Maine Medical that I worked with.
Yeah.
And there were some people in the HCI community that have seen this, and were interested. But I've never let it go. I keep thinking that this is something
Okay.
to get back to.
I'll send an email
I
connection.
appreciate it.
Yes, Jenny.
Hi, Bill. Nice
Hey,
to see
Jenny, how you
you.
doing? Good to see you.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I'm glad you're still working with the HCIM and all of that stuff. And thank you for this presentation. I'm always interested about how things that are developed and which have had a lot of effort put into them can be generalized. And you mentioned that this, you kind of went over fairly quickly that, you know, this could be a general purpose tool that could be useful for breast cancer and, you know, other forms of cancer.
Absolutely.
So my question is, you know, I'd like to get a realistic understanding of what the issues would be in, say, adapting it for breast cancer, both from the design point of view, but also from the personal, well, from the people point of view, persuading people. And I just wondered if you'd thought about that.
We had, and it certainly can apply to risk of any type. It's not specific to cancer risk.
Yeah.
The thing that several people told me when I gave the presentation at the HFES conference was that this could help them explain randomness and uncertainty, just as a general principle. That, you know, most lay people don't really understand what a confidence interval is, and they said that this visualization really helped, and they could use that just for that purpose, regardless of whether they were talking about, you know, cancer, or they were talking about heart disease or anything else. So the only thing that it really requires is the data that drives the tool. So that's why we thought it could be applied across the 3 tools that they had. Other data, they didn't, other cancers, they don't have that kind of data on it. But as long as you have the data that can generate the confidence intervals or some algorithms, something that will get you the output you need for the different variables, it should work fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, getting to the HFES and that community is good, but I think the NIH community is really the home base for this. So I wonder if you know about the OBSSR, the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research at NIH.
No, I don't.
They, you know, they're an interesting bunch, and they are open to this kind of stuff. So I don't know if giving a talk there or seeking funding there or project with them, but, you know, the medical community basically, I mean, there are exceptions, deals with the medical community. You know?
Right.
They really value those things. I mean, maybe the crossover is the MedStar, National Center for Human Factors in Medical, or whatever it's called. But those that you know, Raj Ratwani and others down there, Terry Fairbanks, would be the people who might have other interests in this, you know, in this kind of work. But I would say going, you know, trying to get it's still worth getting to NIH. So anyway, wish you well.
Thanks,
All
man.
right.
Appreciate it.
Yep. So to be fair, the next person is Joel. So Joel nicely typed everything, but I think it would be nicer if you said it yourself, Joel, if you want. Otherwise, I'll read it.
Sure. It was so cool to see that effect of them spontaneously describing a confidence interval, which is a fairly sophisticated concept. Actually, I'm experiencing lag on my end. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. Yeah, so I'm super curious about more details about who you tested this with in terms of their level of numeracy, and if you have any sense about how far this effect extends. And on the flip side, do you think there's any follow-on effects of experiencing this kind of risk communication, whether it prepares them to learn and apply this concept of risk in other settings?
The population that we use for the testing, we tried to find people, and it's tough to, we did not screen for numeracy, but what we tended to do, or what we did, was we recruited people who we knew did not have a strong technical background, a strong science background. So we were basically looking for as layperson as we could get, and that was why we liked the results that we got, was that we believed that these people were probably of that nature that would have some numeracy issue, would not necessarily know. We did ask them if they were familiar with the concept of confidence interval, not going in, because there's too many times we've asked a question and beforehand, and then they come in and say, oh, I didn't know about it, but I spent all last night making sure I did before I came in today. So we did have them ask after the fact, and everybody we tested with had no idea what a confidence interval was. So we were very pleased with the recruit from that standpoint. I think the connection that you're talking about and the ability to generalize this knowledge, I don't know that they know that what they were looking at is a confidence interval. And so later when they encounter a confidence interval, I'm not sure they make the bridge to know that they could translate that into this.
Right.
And
yeah, I don't care if
cool.
they, yeah, I don't care if they use the term confidence interval as long as they use the thinking.
Right.
As long as they get it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I think that when somebody brought up that idea of using this as a general tool to train people on what a confidence interval is, that would help. And it could help in schools. It could help in doctors' offices when they're explaining stuff and they just show the idea. That's what we mean by confidence interval. I think then it would generalize nicely.
Yeah.
We didn't.
I was thinking this could be a really fun template to share with journalists. As like sort of a drop-in thing. If you're talking about risk, here's a good way to communicate that, and then that becomes sort of like a thing that everybody experiences. Right. And becomes lingua franca. Even people don't know what confidence intervals are. They understand, oh, when you're talking about uncertainty, there's a spread, there's a midpoint, and there's fuzzy edges, and that's honestly to me 90% of the battle.
All right, it's decided. I'm going to hire all you guys as my PR firm. It's a great ideas.
Yeah, so I don't know if anybody else wants to raise their hand here. But I was thinking, in the meantime, now I'm thinking maybe this is a case for HCI activism. We really care that they do this properly. So should we all send an email? Who do we send an email to say, like, you got to use this technique, which is obviously better than the bad one that you have now? So it's interesting, like maybe as we age and become more ready to spend our time volunteering to do activism.
Yeah, and again, I think what it suggests, and one of the things I do talk about in my classes is that, especially places like National Cancer Institute, other NIH offices we've worked for, is that they don't have a system engineer. They have developers and they have scientists. And so, you're working on a project and you've got a development staff there, and the technical lead, is an epidemiologist. So it's the classic, if I can use his book without permission, the inmates are running the asylum story that Alan Cooper talks about, is they have so much power because no one understands what they do or can do what they do. And if we had stronger system engineers who understood that and could be the bridge between the implementation and the staff there. So what's going on at NCI is that there's the technical side that handles distributing information outside, and there's all this work in the interior of the research that they're doing. They're not connected very well at all.
Yeah. So maybe the first thing we could do is invite everybody, your neighbors, to come to the HCIL symposium and learn something. Take the tutorial from Bill Killam about introduction to usability, and maybe that will help. But I think, I don't know, like, is there any other questions from the attendance? I don't see any hand raised. Maybe, Bess, you had thought of re-mentioning the announcement from the...
Right. I was going to reintroduce Marcus. And Marcus, if you want to make your announcement again, we would appreciate it. And I know we have a lot of professors in attendance today. So if you could take note of what he is telling us, but he's off screen right now. Marcus.
Right, but maybe the first thing is I should say is, thank you again to Bill. That was a very interesting and practical, and we do care about those topics, and we really hope NCI will improve their interface.
Thank
so
you.
Marcus,
appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
Okay. So my name is Marcus Hines, and I'm the vice president of UX Terps, and it's basically a student organization that aims to foster an inclusive and diverse design community on UMD's campus. And I'm here to share news regarding the Terps Megathon. It is our 3rd annual hackathon event, and this year it'll be virtual. And basically, it's a 24-hour design hackathon at UMD. And I'll post the links regarding the information for it in the chat. And can everyone see it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll also post my email as well if you have any questions. And yeah, that's basically my announcement. Thank you everyone for tuning in.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, I think I especially want to thank Bill for having a shorter talk, short enough that we could ask a lot of questions, because often, you know, people we have like time for 2 questions and that's it. So this is a sign we had a good discussion. So thank you, everyone. Beth, that if you want to close, what's next time, actually?
Well, we're going to all take the week off, enjoy our nice spring break, but then coming up right after that, Catherine Plasson and will be talking to us about tips and tricks to prepare videos and make them accessible. So I hope you're all able to join us. All right.
All right. Very good.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.